Friends, chess players, welcome back. Today we're talking about middle game strategy, and we'll do so using Capablanca's rules. 5 rules you can apply in the middle game to get a better idea of what to do. Today I'll present them to you in the classic way. However, I'll also try to put them into proper context, because if we don't apply these rules thoughtfully, we risk making a mess of things. They're very general rules that give us important suggestions, but we need to put them into context. Anyway, let's start with the first rule and take a look at a game by Capablanca, the Capablanca Tartakower game, where these rules were more or less all applied. Let's look at this game then. It's the game against Tartakower. And the first rule is, activate all your pieces starting from the least active one. Now I'll show you the position. We have this Dutch defense where, let's say, we develop these pieces. It's the classical Dutch, the one with f5, and you can see Capablanca develops all his pieces. At this point, you can see that all the pieces are developed, and it's good practice in the opening not to move the same piece multiple times. So here, Capablanca doesn't move the bishop, doesn't move the knight, nor the other two, because they're all well developed. We need to activate the other pieces. And so he plays queen to e2. I want to make a small jump forward in time, because this rule, of course, is an important rule for a beginner, to always look at the least active piece and try to activate it, let's say the basics of development. However, I want to put this first rule into context with Capablanca's third rule, so let's make this small jump forward in time. Capablanca's third rule, always ask yourself, what is my opponent trying to do? And in my opinion, it's important that this third rule is put in first place, because as I always say, prophylactic thinking and constructive thinking. In constructive thinking, I think about how I can improve my position. And so Capablanca's rule works very well, because in fact, we're talking about improving our pieces, improving our worst piece. The constructive method has a risk, which is not paying attention to what our opponent is doing. So yes, it's great to improve our pieces, but in my opinion, it's even more important to keep an eye out and understand if my opponent has something that could become a threat. And then, if I realize that there's nothing to worry about, I can go ahead and improve my pieces. But in my opinion, the order is important, so first comes the idea of looking at what my opponent wants to do, and then we activate all our pieces. Anyway, let's continue here. Queen to e2 and knight to e4 were played, a couple of pieces were exchanged. Bishop takes a7, knight takes c3, intermediate move b takes c3, queen takes a7. And now we come to Capablanca's second rule. Perhaps his real rule, that is, the rule that allowed him to be one of the players in history who made the fewest blunders. Why did Capablanca make fewer blunders? Generally because he prevented them. So the second rule says, keep everything defended, because if you keep all the pieces in your position well defended, generally speaking, there will be fewer mistakes. We all know, of course, that the concept of tactics often comes into play when there is an undefended piece. So from this point of view, Capablanca never leaves pieces undefended. So what does he play here? He plays a 4 because the a pawn is the only pawn. Let's say that it could remain undefended in this position, so he plays a 4 to try to liquidate. Here, all of this by playing the move f5. In this game, bishop was played to f3, which maybe isn't the most precise move in the world, but it's a practical one. Black tries to unbalance the position, black being Tartakower tries to unbalance it. Let's say the position after bishop takes f3, knight c6. Now the knight, let's say, serves the role of preventing white's push to a5. And obviously in the future, it also wants to occupy the f5 square to, let's say, control the weak pawn on c4. And at this point, Capablanca continues to, let's say, invest in his first rule, that is, activate everything. Activate, starting with what is from the piece. Let's say the one that does the least. In this position, the bishop is developed, the queen is also developed in some way. The rook lends a hand one day to make the move. 5. The piece that's not playing is the rook on f1. What does Capablanca do? Rook f to b1. Black now plays rook to e8, and now finally Capablanca's third rule, which I consider the most important. Pay attention to what your opponent wants to do. Here it's quite clear that the opponent wants to play the move e5, and then obviously the move e4. Or in any case, to capture with the knight after having destroyed our center. You see why prophylaxis is important, right? It's very important, so much so that here Capablanca plays queen to h3. Queen to h3, what is it for? Obviously now, after e5, the pawn, let's say, is left hanging, so queen h3 is played against the move e5. Tartakower then plays the move rook to f6, with which he might want to threaten going to h6. And so Capablanca once again solves two problems. What does my opponent want to do? My opponent wants to play the move rook to h6, aiming to play for e5. In fact, if you look, the queen doesn't have many squares, and so Capablanca plays f4 to ensure that, let's say that the e5 push is no longer a problem, and of course it also gives the queen access to the f3 square again. In fact, after knight to e5, we return to the first rule. Which piece is currently doing less? Let's say, has less play at this moment. Again, it's the queen, so he brings her back into play on f3. But you see how useful understanding is and how it's more important. The third rule then is prophylaxis, because here, before playing queen to f3, I need to make sure, are there any moves that are dangerous that I need to watch out for? So what is my opponent's plan? Since here, for now, my opponent in the end, yes, has played knight 5, but he's not threatening anything. So here I can allow myself to apply the rule. The constructive rule of improvement, so improve your worst placed piece. At this point, the move d6 is played. And so we come to Capablanca's fourth rule, attack. Pawns are easy targets at this moment. Which pawn is it? The weakest one, obviously, is the pawn on e6, to attack the pawn on e6. But somehow I need to open up the attack on e6, so what does Capablanca play? Rook to e1, queen to d7, and then e4. So he manages to open up this position. F takes e4, queen takes e4. Now we're threatening queen takes h6. Obviously g6 is played, and at this point Capablanca's rule comes back into play, the second one, keep everything defended, keep everything defended. And here Capablanca plays g3, a completely unnecessary move, because the f4 square was already solidly defended. There was no problem at all, but he even anticipates an idea like, say, rook to f8 or queen to f7, you see? Why did Capablanca blunder so rarely? Because he defended everything well in advance, so there was no way to make a mistake from this point of view. King to f8, at this point king to g2. We also activate this piece that wasn't doing anything. Rook to f7, and we return to the fourth rule. Pawns, attack the pawns that are easy targets. Another easy target. Which one is it? The pawn on g6, so h4, to create this structural weakness. At this point, black realizes he has to do something because the position here is getting dangerous, and he plays d5, which probably isn't the correct move, but it makes sense that when you think you're about to lose, at a certain point you make a fairly aggressive move anyway. C takes d5, pawn takes d5, everything is exchanged here. And we enter this endgame where, of course, Capablanca plays h5 and creates the weakness on g6. Now we're about to reach the fifth Capablanca rule that concerns the endgame though. Meanwhile, of course, white plays rook to h1 and rook to h7, activating this rook, and at this point rook to c6. A very interesting move because rook to c6 defends c7 and also threatens c3. It would seem that black somehow has found a very interesting play in this position. So what does he do? Capablanca, the last rule. Passed pawns are what allow us to win in the endgame. Be careful, because this rule is strong, but it must be extremely contextualized. Passed pawns are strong, but in the endgame, the activity of the pieces, especially the king, is important. So, what does that mean? That I push the pawns to maybe create passed pawns. That's great. The more advanced the pawn, the more dangerous it will become at some point. But I have to support it with my pieces, because if I push the passed pawn and don't defend it, I'll lose that pawn right away. So pay close attention to the passed pawn, but let's put it in context with the activity of the pieces. Look how beautiful this is. Capablanca plays g5 here, so obviously here, what's the idea? If I had captured this, I take this pawn, and now these two pawns advance on their own. But the best part is coming up soon. Knight to e3, king to f3, knight to f5. And we enter this rook endgame, where once again it seems like black is about to capture the pawn on c3. And so we really are in trouble. And here comes the beauty, the strength of the pawn, a passed pawn in the endgame. King to g3 to activate the king on h4, and after rook to f3, which goes on to capture another pawn. It doesn't matter. Capablanca sacrifices another pawn because the activity of the king with the passed pawn is the most important thing. So now I go to f6, and even being down so many pawns, I still win. Here, obviously, this move loses immediately, because here I threaten mate here, and now checkmate is inevitable. So the third pawn can't be taken. It's black's turn to play rook 4, but now king to f6, and you can see how white, of course, now feasts on the position. thanks to the fact that black's king is just a bystander, and now even the rook becomes a bystander because it has to defend the 8th rank. So here, white simply finishes eating whatever is left in the position, also thanks to this tactic. G7, the pawn can't be taken because this endgame is obviously won quite easily. And so here, plainly, he ate everything that was left and started pushing the other pawn. In short, there's not much to discuss. And obviously, here Tartakoa will resign. You see, these rules can be useful for us to think in a position about which moves to look for. But please always put them into context, because if you start thinking, yes, I need to improve my pieces, and then forget what your opponent is doing, you really risk making a bad move, so be careful. Capablanca's rules can be useful to you, but let's also put them into context. With that, we're done for today. If you want to support me, I always invite you to subscribe. So leave a comment, write how you approach the middle game, and let me know if these rules have been helpful to you. I'll see you in the next videos.